coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Look, first off, we're getting reparations. I mean, people are nuts. If you think, you think California isn't going to pass a reparations bill in the near future, I think you're smoking crack. I mean, we're going to get reparations all over the place. Now, in this case, how do you get reparations? Well, you have to do exactly what Spencer said. You have to talk about some of the worst, most egregious examples, paint some cartoon history so they're completely uncomplicated, and then look at some crimes as all crimes, as many serious crimes are. Any serious crime is something that can't ultimately be repaid, and say, therefore, you owe a kind of blood debt that will have to continuously be repaid. There's no end to it, and there's no end to the logic either.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the Roundtable. It is my maniacal pleasure to have stolen the mic from Ryan once again. He is out. I am your poor man's host, your substitute host, Spencer Clavin. I guess I'm the features editor of the American Mind and the associate editor of the Claremont review of books. This is what you do when you grab the mic. You can give yourself promotions. No, I think this was already approved. And I'm joined remotely by the Motley Crew, by managing editor Seth Barron, by executive editor James Poulos, and by founding editor Matthew Peterson. These gentlemen and I are going to be having a conversation about Pride today. It is in the spirit of Pride Month that we're going to turn the entire podcast into a Pride-themed podcast. This event, which used to just be, like half a weekend, is now an entire month in our national liturgical calendar. This is our first installment of the Roundtable, our first episode in June, which is Pride Month. And we thought, in the spirit of things, in the spirit of rainbow colored logos, and in the spirit of, national and corporate prostrations before the altar of gay pride, we would talk all about pride. And in fact, we don't want to talk about pride in the sense of gay pride, except to mention that it's obviously going on. The things to talk about in that regard are pretty standard. You'll have seen them in previous years. I direct you amusingly to a tweet from Oilfield Rando at Oilfield_Rando, who has been having fun screenshotting the different corporations which have turned their logos rainbow for pride, except in the Middle East. So Mercedes-Benz USA, rainbow. Mercedes-Benz UK, rainbow. Mercedes-Benz Canada, rainbow. Mercedes-Benz Middle East, no change, which it tells you something about the kind of corporate pandering that has become part of Pride season, Pride Month, Pride marches. And then if you go, even over to the New York Times, you'll find an interesting little account of a spat that's going on internally in New York over whether to have cops at Pride. Because, of course, now we have to subsume the Black Lives Matter narrative also into the LGBT narrative so that we can have one giant mega conglomeration of intersectional woke politics to marshal as much power and clout as we can. I would say it's as yet undetermined what the outcome of that will be, but both Pride marches, including cops, that is gay cops marching in Pride, and cops protecting Pride from crime and assault, are potentially under scrutiny, potentially going to be banned in the wake of George Floyd, in the wake of our newly ascendant BLM regime. I say all of that in the way of kind of getting it out of the way, because we're not really actually here to talk about gay pride, except as it raises this concept of pride more generally, pride as a vice and a virtue. And obviously pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. There is a certain kind of pride which goeth before the fall. And yet there is also a certain kind of pride, national pride, and indeed personal pride, which we think of as merited. We want indeed to look in the mirror, and as James was saying off mic, we want to feel psyched about what we see. But there's complexity in that for democratic nations, where there's something about pride that's kind of inherently anti-democratic in the sense that it invests us with a sense that we are special, others are not. Pride is a limited commodity, a zero-sum game. And currently, I think we're under assault to our national pride from any number of angles. The 1619 Project narrative about America as a disastrous aberration, a mistake, an abortion of a country, and our sense of inadequacy in the face of the digital revolution, in the face of a rising China, in the face of any number of other sort of alarming national events. And so we thought it would be a good moment to revisit this political philosophical question of pride and just how, indeed, in 2021, Americans might pursue and recover a healthy sense of national pride based not, indeed, on one's woke identity, demographic characteristics, but on the true merit and excellence of the nation. I'm going to actually just throw this open generally to the group. I don't have any particular question, but I know that you all have a number of rich thoughts on the topic of pride in democratic nations. So discuss.
Well, I think I'd start out with the very brief observation that however people are going to reclaim this salutary pride, it's not going to come by way of battling over who, as we say these days, quote unquote, gets to be proud of themselves. This is now the catchphrase that has polluted so much of online discourse, where the real debate over power structures is over who gets to do this or gets to do that, or in fact gets to be this or that. And viewing these sorts of things, one's very self-regard as a kind of prize to be awarded or a kind of good or service to be rendered on the basis of, some qualification that your government or some other overlord deems you to have met. Real salutary pride is not something that can be captured in or substituted with honors handed out by the state or by a corporation or a famed society or any other sort of source of noble titles. And the ravenousness in American life today for someone to please hand me a noble title, is all consuming, and I find it difficult to attribute it solely to the kind of cult of self-esteem and participation trophy culture that I guess many Americans now grew up with. It doesn't really, I don't think it's enough to explain what this voraciousness is, this sort of hollowness of soul that makes people feel that if they are not officially singled out for a certain kind of honor, then they are being, in effect, dishonored.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing, there's so many different angles here, right? But it just strikes me how odd it is that going back to the rainbow pride and these identity categories, I mean, really, it's whoever credentials those categories, right? I mean, they're the ones who are divvying out the kind of honors you're describing. So however you cut and slice the categories, then whoever has power is sort of giving out honors accordingly. And, I don't have this all figured out, but just to unpack a little bit of that, I mean, it does strike me as this becomes a problem the more that you have diversity, right? I mean, if you have a lot of different kinds of people and more of them, and there's millions of them, and there's 10 millions of them, and there's hundreds of millions of them, and there's billions of them, how are you going to differentiate or yourself in that mix? And so there's a kind of just dumb quality to it where you need to simplify how you create some kind of hierarchy and how you dole out honors. And the atomization bit that the scholars would talk about certainly seems to be here as well. And I guess the difference would be if you look at any society, any human society, and you thought about, well, what do people take pride in? First, you would, I think, at our best, you see people who have developed certain habits of being, certain ways of life, or kinds of action habitually over time that differentiate them and make them excellent in some way. Call me old school. But it wouldn't have anything to do with some broad category that's like a on or off, black or white, flip the switch, and you're either this or that. That seems to be a kind of retardation of any kind of real notion of excellence. But, take the category of race, right? I mean, it's the most natural thing in the world for anyone who is living in some kind of rooted situation with family and community to take pride in their ancestry going back, right? And thinking, well, my parents, I'm proud of them because they did this. My grandparents, I'm proud of them because they did this. And then if I live in a society where there's a bunch of families in a tribe, say, living together, I'm proud of all these families that because I'm related to them in some way. And we're all part of this tribe, and there's been ups and downs, but overall, I'm proud of this background. And furthermore, that means I have some kind of duty to the future for my own line of children potentially, and my own society. And that's very natural, and it makes a lot of sense. And I don't really even know how to describe this. It's so paltry, right? It's so thin. The idea that you're grabbing on to abstract categories in the broadest possible way. And the only thing I can think is more along the lines of what James is saying, like it's people dispensing honors on this basis. So it's all you have to go for, right? And you don't have any place to kind of stand. There's nothing to do push-ups off of. Everything is just liquid around you. And so you're struggling in the midst of that for just basic pattern recognition. And so you go, okay, we go to these racial and sexual categories. Those could easily morph into something else. I don't know.
Well, we saw some of this come up last week with our friend Chris Rufo, who was being interviewed by Mark Lamont Hill, who's like a Black writer and journalist and ferocious anti-Zionist. And Mark Lamont Hill was asking Chris, like, well, who's done a lot of work exposing critical race theory agendas and curricula and indoctrination in government and corporate circles. He was saying, well, what is it that you're proud? What is there to be proud of being white? And Chris, to his credit, refused to fall for this trap, because of course we all know that it's fine to be proud of being anything but being white. And it's true. It is absurd to say that you're proud to be part of some group that encompasses tens of millions or billions of people. I mean, what did you do? What kind of credit can you take for that? So Chris just said, well, I'm not really interested in talking about what I'm proud of. I just don't think that certain characteristics that are ascribed to white people, such as timeliness, these are sort of what we think of as positive characteristics, being on time, individual accomplishment, things like that. It doesn't make sense to ascribe those to white people. Those are universal characteristics and they're positive. Now, it's funny because Chris Rufo is Italian. I don't know but he seems to know a lot about Italy. I mean, he easily could have done what white people are sometimes encouraged to do, which is, well, if you're going to take pride in your race, at least base it in your European heritage. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily have one European heritage, or they're just like a melange. They're not very connected to whatever it was that they were. But Chris, to his credit, didn't get into it. It's a weird thing because it almost seemed like Mark Lamont Hill was trying to taunt Chris into taking this bait and saying, well, I'm proud to be white because white people are on time, or white people do this or that, at which point he would have been instantly canceled as a white nationalist. So it's definitely a very weird calculus going on.
Yeah, I'm sitting here trying to parse, because of course, pride is not just a topic for modern political philosophy, right? It's one of the oldest subjects of inquiry and attention in all sort of history and political thought. And there's, at the beginning, I mentioned the Proverbs quote, right? Pride goes before the fall. This is the gaon, the sort of like ostentatious and defiant self-regard that allows people to defy God, that sort of say, well, God says this, but I'll do this other thing. And there are a million other Bible verses you could quote, right? That, that the Lord has set my feet very high and I shall never be moved, all this stuff. And I feel as again, conducting here some sort of like on the fly philology. So no, you guys don't have to hold me to this going forward. But I feel as if there's a relation between this pride and the famous Greek hubris, right? Which is the thing that kind of carries you out flush with success from some big triumph, like say the Greeks' triumph over the Persians. You begin to believe that you can't lose. And this is the sort of seed of your downfall, because ultimately, of course, you forget what made you great in the first place. And both of these seem to me to have a sort of sense of, by very virtue of just being, right, I have nothing to worry about, that I'm kind of cleared of the need to prove myself, to prove my worth and my right to exist, or my, ability to exist in this hard, cruel world. It's just, why? I just am. It's just me, And I think we kind of all, as Matt was indicating with the race stuff, but just in general, right, we all have this yearning to be that, to be kind of worthwhile just because we're us, And in some sense, it seems to me like there's an element of this in the wearing your identity as a badge part of things, that you put that title on yourself. You even just maybe claim, like the Demi Lovato thing, right? You just sort of say, I'm non-binary, and then magically you have attributed to yourself like this essence, which is itself worthy of praise without having to do anything else. And it's very harsh in the end, actually, and hard to realize that no, nations are in competition with one another. Resources are scarce, and so what you want to be doing is sort of seeking some excellence to attribute your pride to. I mean, there's other words in Greek, right, for pride, and they have to do with how you think of yourself and how your aristocracy, right, your phronema, and these are dirty words now in democratic politics for the reason that sort of Tocqueville and others elucidate, which is that we have this kind of generalize too much, right? We don't want pride to be a specific thing. This is my home, my native land. But, I'm thinking here also about Burke, right? To help us love our country must be lovely. And I wonder whether actual pride is such a delicate and difficult thing to attain and foster in a nation and a people, that you always have to be kind of earning it and pointing to your accomplishments without resting on them. And you're in this delicate game of congratulating yourself for the real things that you've done that you can be proud of, but also not, therefore just sort of falling into this complacency that it's almost impossible to maintain that. And in the end, you kind of slide into this thing where you just want to grab pride so that you can assuage that hunger that James was talking about, so you don't have to feel that hunger. And indeed, you can kind of consider yourself set for life.
It is remarkable how, despite all this talk of pride flying around, there are so many things which it is now considered inappropriate or even morally wrong to be proud of. Pride in your country. Oh, well, no, that's bad. Pride in your family. No, that's also bad. Pride in your own personal accomplishments and achievement. No, that fails to understand the social superstructures that are truly responsible for what has happened to you. Pride in your God, in your form of religion. No, this is frowned upon. Pride in your tribe, that's also unacceptable. Even, pride in your sports team, if it has the wrong name, or if, the owners have a certain past, then that's also bad. Pride in your humanity. No, that is actually prejudice in favor of human beings, who of course are the most rapacious, cancer-like entity ever to be loosed on planet Earth. Everywhere you turn, there's in fact a prohibition on pride, or on a form of pride, a form of love, really. And so, speaking as a Greek person, or at any rate, a half Greek person, these questions of identity that Chris Rufo dealt with considerable dispatch have always struck me as bizarre and strained, and begging more questions than they answer. I'm only half Greek, and so whenever I talk to a real Greek person, they they ask me where in Greece I'm from, and I have to disappoint them. And then they ask me if I speak Greek, and I have to disappoint them again. And yet, nevertheless, this is a part of my identity that has been significant over the course of my life. But Greek is not just a nation, it's not just a tribe, it's not just a family bloodline. It's sort of a civilization of its own, and a very peculiar one in the history of the West. And even still, after the siege of the final siege of Constantinople, the Greek people have not distinguished themselves very highly in any regard. And they like many in the sort of Justinian ex-Byzantine diaspora are not distinguished particularly well for their timeliness. There are all kinds of Eastern Mediterranean traits that are not associated with the kind of waspy, striver, bourgeois, anal retentive character who is lampooned and assaulted in the critical race theory materials. And then you introduce the layer of religion onto that. And so, my sensibility has always been shaped by a great multiplicity of historical identities, things that sometimes fit very well together, sometimes don't. They change over time. They have intertensions. And of them all, the idea that whiteness is going to loom over this, complex historical and anthropological landscape to blot out all of the differences that can't be separated from identities. It's identities and differences together. The idea that whiteness comes along and sort of renders everything to this giant blank that becomes a projection screen for whatever retaliatory fantasies you have has always struck me as deeply absurd, whether it's coming from the realm, the irrational realm, or from the hyper rational realm, of modern scientists who were looking to reduce human beings down to this handful of categories. And they were the ones who settled on the idea that, well, you can really just divide up all the human race into 3 or 4 buckets, and those are races, and this is the shortcut to understanding human beings. And that's proven to be, I think, completely ridiculous and, a failed project, even on its own terms, which is why once you start going down this road of essentializing categories, they tend to fracture and fragment at every turn. And, I don't think that process is anywhere near done yet in this country or elsewhere, unfortunately.
Hey, James, you bringing up the Greek thing, it reminded me of something funny. A few years ago, I was in Turkey, and I was just walking around Istanbul, and I saw this weird little building, this little church. And I realized that this was actually the living seat of the Greek Orthodox Church. It's still in, Constantinople. And it was tiny and obscure. And above the door, it read, Ne multu Turcum diene, which means in Turkish, how happy is he who can say, I am a Turk. And it's like this Ataturk came up with this phrase. Yeah. And I guess they even though this was the seat, the head, I guess, the stephalos of the Greek Orthodox Church, they had to maintain this like bizarre phrase about Turkish pride. It seemed really like the epitome of the conquered person, or the conquered, whether they're really conquered, in spirit, obviously they're not conquered, but it was very interesting. And I don't know, just reminded of that.
Well, it is interesting. And, I'm certainly not going to be the one to apologize for the Ottoman Empire on the Roundtable podcast, but it is not a commonly known fact that, that after the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Ottomans needed capable people to run their administrative state. And they managed to find them for, long enough that even after everything had kind of soured in the Ottoman Empire, the administrative bureaucracy was still sort of chugging along. And many of those people were, in fact, Greek. They were the ones who knew how to keep the wheels of some kind of imperial structure running. And they did. So, it's the way in which these categories have been completely reified and turned into toys or building blocks for, over-credentialed educators to fill the minds of students with information that befits a people who are not expected to have any future whatsoever. It's really, it is sad. And, Americans, we got ourselves into this mess. And I do think that we can get our way out, because at the end of the day, America has always been a rather pluralistic place. And that balance between, one nation under God, even though that was introduced fairly recently into the lexicon, it's always kind of been the spirit of the people. And in spite of that fact, profound differences that can't be easily parsed out from our shared identity, but, which are there nonetheless. And every attempt to wipe out those differences in America has ultimately failed. And I think any path forward where we can be, have that salutary pride in who we are as Americans, but not just as Americans. Our identity as Americans isn't supposed to eat or swallow or blot out all of our other affiliations and associations and shared identities. It's striking that kind of balancing act is something that has been kind of our unique burden in some ways, but it's one that we continuously manage to pull off, even with the ups and downs. And I think that, that process is capable of returning us to an understanding of identity and difference that is not a caricature or, a sort of weaponized piece of a totalizing ideology.
I do wonder
exactly why the concept of America and Americanism is so important. And maybe there seems to me to be a direct relationship between our understanding of being an American as a thing, and then the degree to which we're going to rely upon these tribalized identities, right? To the extent you denigrate what it means to be a citizen, which has always been tied to some form of ethnicity in most cases, then what do you have left to fall back on, right? You're going to have to, if you eradicate any real notion of citizenship, you're going to have to fall back on these identities. And look, just to clarify what I mentioned earlier, I certainly didn't mean to say people should be ashamed because they're white, right? That's ridiculous. It's a trap. The question that Rufo was asked is a trap. To get him to say he is proud of being white and he's proud of having the same qualities that critical race theory, in fact, ascribes to white people. This is Anton's celebration parallax. If you say what they say, you're in trouble. But nonetheless, this let me put it this way. I think that there's a lot of thoughtful people who have written about the Black experience in America of late in the last 30, 40 years, who would say that a big part of the problem, or what plagues some of these, what's behind the scenes in a lot of these issues, is a kind of insecurity and questioning about what it means to be Black in America, right? And the response from the left is, you should be proud of being Black and that identity. And I think that's ultimately a problem if it's not tied to something deeper. We can do tribalism. That's fine. Everyone's going to do tribalism if it comes down to it. You want the politics of the prison yard. That's what you're going to get. That's already what you're getting with the kids in America. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. But the problem is that it's not as if any of us are trying to get rid of the concept of race, but this is usually in a healthy society tied to a number of other things. And so one way to put this is that, telling people, well, you should be proud because you're Black. And if you just have self-esteem because of your Black identity, you're going to, this is the way forward. Ultimately that's thin gruel. And even a kind of tribalized politics of the prison yard is ultimately going to glob on to something else, because this is such a thin category. And I don't mean to say that ethnicity and race is ultimately thin, but it's tied to deeper concepts. And it's very hard to talk about in this concept. But I think that all sides in this who think they're, part of radically different subgroups on Twitter actually share some of the same assumptions and I don't know, like hollowed out understandings of how this stuff works.
You're making me think, Matt, of Aristotle's response to Plato about holding wives in common. You know, at the beginning of the politics, he's trying to deal with the Republic and the notion that everybody will hold, or the guardians will hold all things in common. And he says, you know, that sounds as if it's an expansion of love, but it's actually a dilution of love. That when you put a little bit of wine into a lot of water, it's impossible to taste it. And just in the same way, if everybody owns everything, nobody has any devotion or attachment to any one individual thing. And I wonder whether some of these tribal categories are compelling to people precisely in the absence of a definite idea of American identity, citizenship, nationhood, because they're more concrete, right? I mean, say what you will about gayness as an identity, about blackness as an identity, or, you know, blackness in America as an identity, right? They have discernible histories to them. And there's like a lot of intellectual work and also commercial work and, you know, just energy on the part of our elite ruling classes going into developing a compelling, cogent picture of what that means. And that picture might be false and distorted and messed up in all of its particulars, but people can latch onto it, and you need something to latch onto, right? You need that thing that's everybody has this experience, right? Of like the particular thing about you that's kind of funny is this, and like people love to talk about it at parties way more than people like to hear about it. This is why everybody likes talking about themselves, right? And yeah, I feel as if in part as a result of leftist assaults on American history and identity, and in part as a result of a kind of what Michael Anton calls crackerjack. I can't remember if it's Claremontism or conservatism, but he notes this idea, you know, America is just a set of ideas, a sort of abstracted set of ideas. Well, nobody ever really, you know, made his home on a set of ideas either. And so people have kind of had systematically taken out from under them every solid ground upon which they might rest a sense of themselves as part of something that is not merely tribal, not merely racial or sexual, but actually has, you know, a history and involves us in a people and a national project. Like there's something about the specificity of that is currently lacking from our sense of what it means to be an American.
Yeah, maybe we should say too, if you're listening to this and, you know, I could see someone calling me a cuck and saying, you guys are all, you know, you're all pretty soft on this issue. And maybe that's because for a lot of younger people, they actually need to hear it's okay to be white, right? Because they've been told it's not. And it should be more than okay to be white. But if you put it in that term, you know, that's the trap, right? Then you're a Nazi. I mean, no one here is if you that's what people need to hear because they've been assaulted, right, with these categories that you're describing the need for. Okay, yeah, then sure. I don't think that anyone on the podcast though is afflicted by that propaganda, or it hasn't affected us over the years in the way that I could see it affecting someone, you know, growing up now, and then saying, well, damn it is okay to be white, and you know, I'm proud of it, and there's all kinds of great things that come along with it, right? I mean, and start talking the same way that everyone else is able to talk. But I just don't. I think it's a real problem if you don't have a concept of citizenship, and you don't have the kinds of things that you're talking about and we're all talking about, that you can't actually tie in accomplishments to be proud of to, you know, some specific part of a community or part of a family you're part of. You know, I mean, yeah, then this is just going to multiply and it's just going to get worse. And you know, I mean, the politics of the prison yard, if that's what you want, that's what you'll get. The one thing I would note, though, is that, you know, eventually that dies out and something else has to emerge, because the prison yard is a very rarefied space. Actually, it's you know, naturally over time, given time and space, people develop more interesting notions of excellence that are certainly related to, you know, hereditary qualities, but it you know, ethnicity is probably the word that we'd be looking for. In any event, I just think I think that there's something pathetic and grasping, right, about all of this, and it really, if you were an alien from outer space, I think you'd actually feel bad for a lot of people who are struggling with this, yeah, you know, in their souls and straining themselves and in bizarre ways, right, to try to wring more out of these categories of identity than ought to be wrung.
Well, yeah. And the sad thing is, and, you know, it's hard not to be a little smirk a little when you think about this, but with the emphasis on pride and just talking about how proud you are of this pride, well, then you kind of have to wonder, like, I mean, methinks the lady doth protest too much. Like, what is all of this pride speak covering up? I mean, I'm not the one who's going to say that people should be ashamed of themselves, but it certainly sounds like they're covering up some shame or something. I don't know, I don't really feel like society at this point is going out of its way to isolate or shun gay people. So I don't really know why there's this insistence on the pride. But I guess, or for any identity, I mean, it's become very kind of involuted, so that, I mean, it does seem like they're trying to, like what you said about Anton and the celebration parallax, they're trying to force like just white people into this position where they will say, well, we're proud to be white. But then the hammer drops. Like, nope, that's not allowed. I mean, a few years ago, I was joking with some friend, and we were thinking, like, okay, so someone had put up a piece of paper that said it's okay to be white in some college or something, and everybody made a big fuss about it and called in the police. So I was thinking, suppose you just put up a sign that said, it's okay to be, or it's okay. Or suppose you just put up a blank piece of paper, like a white piece of paper. Like, maybe that would be like, I mean, at what point can you, you can police this to the end, obviously, as we've seen with, like, hand gestures, every hand, basically any movement it can be interpreted as hateful, as the wrong kind of pride.
Don't you think that your point about having to say pride, I mean, that to me, it says a lot. I mean, the pride and shame, right? And if it's exactly right. If you have to say over and over again, I'm proud of this, I'm proud of this, I'm proud of this. I mean, I'm sorry, like any read of human nature, forgive me, is somewhat universal. What does that tell me? That tells me there's a deep insecurity there, or something you're combating within yourself, or that you see yourself combating outside of you, to have to say this over and over again. Because if you're actually confidently proud of something, you don't have to say it, right? A big dog doesn't bark. You don't see, can you imagine? It's like imagining ancient Rome having tons of ceremonies just talking about, how proud I am to be Roman, how proud I am to be Roman. Either you build the monuments or you don't. And so when you see these wars going on now, they want you to, clearly the attack is against whiteness itself and against America itself, right? I mean, those are the two things you should not be proud of, and everything else you should be proud of. And you do have to wonder, like, where is this coming from? And ultimately, of course, it has to be tied to some real achievement. So that's what I mean when we say it's not enough. These are broad categories and they're thin. For most human history, if you're in a tribe, you can ascribe certain achievements in the past that you can actually list out, right? Upsides and downsides, a real history that's substantial. And that is from whence you derive a kind of pride. So it's a just this grasping, terrible thing, and there's no end to pushing it. I mean, there's clearly no end to pushing it.
Well, we talk a lot about pride coming before the fall for obvious reasons, but it's important to remember too that in many cases pride comes after the fall. You're laid low, but you're still sort of shaking your fist at whoever's above you, going like, well, you're still the worst and I'm still awesome, and F you. And the question that we're left with after the pride parade goes down the street, whose ever pride it is now what? If you throw yourself a party for being who you are, and then what are you going to do when you wake up the next morning? I think it was Baudrillard who joked, like, what are you doing after the orgy? And Huela Beck, who said that the last myth in the West was that sex is something to do. Like these French guys, like they understood that things that the Anglos were still getting this big rise out of. They're sitting here, smoking their last cigarette down in the filter, going like, well, tomorrow you will wake up and then you will be in my world, my friend. And, there's the problem, the intransigence of pride against all evidence, against all evidence that in fact you have backed yourself into a corner, or that you have, you have been lying to yourself, that you have willfully led yourself down the primrose path, obstinately, stubbornly refused to accept that you are lying to yourself. These are the hallmarks of pride, and these are things that human beings do to themselves, even after they have begun to rack up defeats in their life, whether as individuals or as a people. And so, the real question that I think we need to pose amid all of the celebrations of various forms of pride is okay, so you feel good about who you are, now what? And there's a resounding silence to that. We're entering into a period of time where people, especially our leadership class, such as it is, are so completely flummoxed about how to even live well in the world that we have created, that falling back on the idea of like, well, I may not know what the hell is going to happen, in 10 years or 5 years or 10 weeks or even tomorrow, but damn it, I can at least celebrate being myself, whatever I interpret that to mean. That is like a humiliating retreat from the heights of civilization down to something that is ultimately, about as sustainable as an orgy or a parade.
Yeah, I think this is spot on. I mean, a lot of the gay stuff, at least, seems to me to arise from the fact that really there is no obstacle to gay people living their lives as they choose in America, certainly right now, with some sort of minor exceptions. You can do and date whoever you want. And there's like still a lot of unhappy gay people, right? And instead of like spending time examining why that might be, instead of like, you then have to do this like hard work of sort of being like getting your life together and paying attention to like other stuff that's much more difficult, like forming lasting and meaningful relationships and like forming community and building a home. And all of this stuff is like very, very hard. And people have basically set their teeth against it on some level ideologically, but in some cases, just like there's obstacles that they have to, there's like psychological work that they have to do or whatever. And yeah, this stuff is like much, much more difficult than throwing a parade. So I completely agree about all of this. I mean, I did want to incorporate one other element of the sort of identity pride into the mix, because we were talking off mic about the fact that there's a new identity, and that is the identity of masker, I who mask, right? And that people don't want to take off their masks, even if they're vaccinated, for precisely this reason, because they might look like Republicans, they might look like Trumpists, they might look like, you name it. And we thought we'd incorporate into this the latest sort of email dump to shake the American media. And that is Anthony Fauci has had a bunch of emails released. Various revelations are coming out of it, like that Fauci seems to have tried to sort of diffuse the lab leak hypothesis, which is now looking more and more acceptable publicly, more and more plausible. But just still more generally, Fauci's role as not merely, impartial observer, but as just seriously meddlesome engager in people's lives has really done a number on people psychologically, to the extent that we are now confronted with a whole new category of people who have exactly the problem that really we've been talking about, which is like, what are they going to do with their lives, right? As James was saying, this is a time when robots get better and better at doing the things that we used to claim only we could do, doing work, for example. This is a moment when when America itself seems hugely diffident and indeed even self-condemnatory, and people just want to know a reason to get up in the morning. And Fauci St. Fauci, and that's not an exaggeration, that's like a prayer candle that exists. St. Fauci is kind of a dispenser, among other things, of sources of pride, right? I'm proud because I never left my home once during the pandemic. I'm proud because I never took my mask off. I wonder if you guys have thoughts about the emails, whether you've read them, and if not, just, where whether the Fauci cult can sustain the pride that it's generated going forward.
I mean, I think Fauci is going to go the way of Cuomo, who was also venerated and lionized and spoken of as like some kind of savior. And, it's funny because the two of, if you recall, the two of them were on television together talking about like who would play them in a Francis Ford Coppola or Scorsese film, like these two Italians, like De Niro and Pacino. It's like, okay, well, as it turns out, they cast themselves as the gangsters and the liars. I mean, all of those characters that people love so well are just like murderers. And so that's what it turns out these two are, essentially. So I think at this point, Fauci's like living on borrowed time, but I'm sure it's going to turn on him. I mean, I'll just remind everybody again, like in the 80s, back to the gays. I mean, Larry Kramer and the ACT UP people said that Fauci was Mengele. I mean, he was considered like a demon. So I wonder if that old reputation will come back.
Well, he's got a book coming out about how great he is. So, in that respect, he's definitely taking the Cuomo path. And they're also doing a documentary about him. But he's probably just going to get cycled out of the public eye, reassigned to some other position. There's no, the bureaucracy is under no legal obligation to purge itself of people for bad behavior. You really have to go above and beyond to violate the law. And even then, you're not guaranteed of being booted out. And as far as I know, there's really no sort of oversight entity in Congress or anywhere else that's tasked with making sure that bureaucrats are punished commensurate with their misdeeds or negligence. It's not like they get voted out for bad behavior or something. And so, Fauci's a pretty robust guy for 80 years old. I don't know what supplements he's been taking, but depending on what's in them, I'll have what he's having, and he'll probably haunt us for years to come.
Well, to your point, sorry, go ahead, Matt.
What can we say in terms of pride? I mean, there's sort of what comes along with the weaknesses that we're talking about is an inability to recognize actual forms of excellence. And so just as people accept certain categories, which are real, but handed to them in some kind of hierarchical way for the sake of those in power, you also have the idea that there is this expert class that people immediately grab onto. And when you look at how childish the American people have been, I mean, it's really revolting, right? I mean, the idea of Fauci as hero is disgusting to me. And as soon as you recognize who this guy is, he's 80 years old. I mean, he's already won in a way, right? Whether he gets rid of him or not, he's lived his entire life in one job. Just you want to talk about excellence? You don't do that, right? It's very rare that someone can be in any leadership position and maintain it for 40 years without, some kind of calcification and some kind of cancerous growth coming in somewhere, unless it's a very dynamic environment. And even then, it's never, it's like Hutchins said about being president of a college. You give it 10 years and move on. It's founder's syndrome in business. When someone found something and they stay there too long, and then it leads to a disaster, it becomes a selfish thing, and they F everything up for everybody else. So just on the sheer, the outside appearance, this makes no sense. And if you're in a government bureaucracy and you're in charge for decades, it's abundantly clear what's going on. And so I don't know what the experience of the audience is, but as soon as you recognize who this guy is, you've met him before. This is a shameless liar whose entire life, he can pathologically lie very smoothly. He's been doing it for years. And the way if you've ever encountered someone like this in your life, you know how they work.
They will shamelessly lie. You don't believe that these kind of people can exist if you haven't met them before. And his whole entire his whole career is based upon keeping his position, which he has done. So I commend him for that. This guy's he's got a superpower, really. And he realized that the elite at the time, wanted a way to talk about AIDS in a way that would be, get the attention of the larger population. He figured out a way to do that, and he kind of rode that wave for decades. So this guy is a pathological liar. He's really a kind of sociopath, and he'll never change. Like the lizard brain is very powerful and way too imprinted, and he's basically won. So I sure as hell hope that Seth is right, and I sure as hell hope that there's going to be, some kind of, we realize someone needs to be kind of a fall guy, and we really should investigate some of these things, like the fact that the U.S. government is funding the research at the lab that leaks the virus that creates this pandemic. But I don't hold out any hope for it. And I think what's disgusting about it is, like, how would you trust, when you talk about pride, how would you trust a people who think Fauci is a wonderful thing and treat him as some kind of god, right? They treat a man like that as if he's some kind of god, and they cling to him as if to, some comforting blanket. And then those people talk about what they're proud of. I wouldn't trust what they think about pride at all, because they have no ability to evaluate actual excellence or virtue.
I mean, one of the most kind of riveting features, grimly riveting features of the emails is how many of them are just random folks, people reaching out to this guy whom they probably hadn't heard of previously. And probably, Matt, they weren't aware of Fauci's long history of failing upward. But they were emailing him about, like, should I cancel my school play? Should my rabbi move this service? And he was answering them. I mean, he's really, talk about shameless on both sides of that engagement, right? I need this divine government figure to pronounce upon the viability of my personal gathering. And this divine government figure is actually a person that considers himself qualified, worthy, ready to pronounce upon that. These sorts of things are kind of remarkable, and that's what they're trying to spin to the positive, right? I mean, that's what the BuzzFeeds and the Washington Posts of the world are trotting out as if he was this, he's this caring practitioner. Even during the chaos of a Trump administration, he took time to. But right, I mean, this is like a kind of behavior that indicates just like fawning subjection. And to James's point, you're often, James, reminding us that one of the features of the digital era is a kind of access to backstage information and accountability that we didn't otherwise have. And accountability is death to pride, right? I mean, this is like our heroes are liable to fall again and again if we are able, if we hold them to this standard, and if in fact the digital media channels that are available to us can uncover all of these things about them. I mean, it's going to take a more and more concerted effort, it seems, on the part of institutional pride makers, people who would protect a Fauci or a Cuomo. It takes like a harsher and harsher form of informational authoritarianism to keep these folks' inadequacies out of the public eye.
We certainly don't break news on this podcast for obvious reasons, but it would be remiss. I would be remiss not to point out for all of us that apparently, as of now, the Fauci book has been scrubbed from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. So maybe he will have to haunt us from a greater distance than at first I characterized. It's, everyone is expendable. That is one thing that the internet has taught us, is that you can be snuffed out and replaced with some, close approximation of you, no matter who you are. It would not be shocking if Fauci was snuffed, so to speak, and replaced with some other functionary. This is the genius of overproducing an elite. Sure, it makes a lot of people miserable and jaded and predisposed to hate the regime, but you have this standing reserve of functionaries who can step in and play these kinds of roles, if and when they outlive their purpose or make a mistake, or just, the system simply tires of them.
So this suggests that Seth is right. I mean, they're going to cycle him out, as you say, and that also suggests that they want to do some kind of, it's such an egregious juxtaposition right now between the reality that was available, like as I said about the Suds. It's not like they were really intelligent, really smart pseudonymous people on Twitter figuring this out in February of 2020. They were people who were able to do a basic Google search and discover some of these facts about the Wuhan lab. And so in other words, it must be so egregious that they're going to have to take a scalp and bend a little bit. Do we think that that's the case? That certainly seems to be indicated by what's going on.
Well, in the time that remains to us, we wanted to address one more very public issue of national pride that has emerged over the past couple of days. Joe Biden, remember him, the president of the United States, flew to Tulsa, Oklahoma on Tuesday to mark the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. This was a, extremely bloody and tragic event in the history of this country. I'm reading from the BBC, so here's the kind of officialized narrative of it, right? A group of white Americans razed the affluent and predominantly black neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa. The community, known by the moniker of Black Wall Street, was the country's wealthiest African-American neighborhood until its many homes and businesses were burned down in the riot. I didn't mean to, by calling that the officialized narrative, I didn't mean to cast aspersions on that particular element of it. But I do mean to raise for our attention the way that this got then narrativized by Biden and by the news outlets, right? My fellow Americans, this was not a riot, says Biden. This was a massacre and among the worst in our history. For much too long, the history of what took place here was told in silence, cloaked in darkness. And this speech was followed with calls for reparations, an age-old issue that has been more and more de rigueur and popular. The idea being, right, that this was depredation, and now black people are owed money from white people in atonement for this historical sin. I mean, we're familiar now with the logic of this sort of thinking, but it seemed like another issue to bring up in the context of national pride. And I wondered what you guys thought in terms of bringing the notion of history into that. I mean, history is one of the things of which one is sort of invited to be proud in a nation. And it seems now as if we are invited to be ashamed of the bad parts of our history, although not proud of the good parts. What do you guys make of this?
Oh, yeah. We're definitely supposed to take pride in all of our shame and breastfeeding. What's interesting about this recent, commemoration is that I gather that some group had raised about $30 million to hold a major memorial commemoration. And then there, like Stacey Abrams was involved, some other high-profile people. And then I guess it fell apart because there was this question, well, why don't we use all this money to compensate the survivors and their families? But then other people said, no, this money is for us. The government should be in charge of the reparations. So then the whole thing fell apart and they couldn't go forward with it, which, seems kind of bleakly ironic that, I mean, that's what these things oftentimes come down to. I just want to point out, I mean, and this is also maybe a little bit mean-spirited, but all right, a couple of things. Well, one, this phrase race massacre came out of nowhere. I've never heard this term before in my life. And now, overnight, they had just rechristened this riot or whatever it was. I mean, it seems like it was pretty bad, a race massacre. Even though if you look at the history of it, actually it started with the massacre of 10 white people by Black World War I veterans. And then the whites in the community, really went to town and totally destroyed the whole Black neighborhood. But just the mean-spirited thing I was going to say is the idea that, okay, they called it Black Wall Street. And it sounds like it was a prosperous type of community. But I feel like people have reified this nickname, Black Wall Street, so they imagine that now that trillions of dollars of equity were destroyed. But really, don't you think Black Wall Street was kind of like an ironic term, maybe used on both sides, like to describe a part of town that had like couple black barber shops, a bank, a real estate office, an insurance office. I mean, it's like, obviously it wasn't like a center of international finance. It was just like a joke. But now they've taken it to be like, oh, this really was Black Wall Street. And if it had been around, we would have seen magnificent dynastic wealth come out of that. Look, it's obviously a terrible thing that happened, but I don't really know like how vast the riches were.
Well, I don't know either. I mean, to be honest with you, I doubt very much that this is a community that would have generated for its inheritors an enormous sums of wealth. But the thing about these reparations narratives is that they always adopt a logic according to which the valuation of the crime is incalculable, as indeed it must be, because there is no price that you can put on like the death of a human being. There's no price that you can put on the enslavement of a human being. The only solution is like after the bloodletting of the Civil War, this hard, dirty work of forgiveness, right? Of abolishing debt, because there's no amount of human money that can make up. Like this is another sort of parallax. It seems to me is this notion, first of all, that what we lost was worth X amount of dollars. But also at the same time, the kinds of things that you're talking about, the kinds of sins that you're talking about are actually of incalculable negative worth, right? You've incurred an incalculable, the minute one person has killed another person, you've incurred incalculable death. We count that not as something that is inherited because it's a debt of guilt. It's not a debt of like fiduciary value. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me as if like the whole notion, yes, I think there's a kind of myth, right, that had this event, this admittedly terrible event not occurred, there would be all of these incredibly wealthy Black families around. But it seems also to me like calculating that is a kind of like smokescreen, because ultimately what they want is like a permanent tax on whiteness.
Right. There's no, I mean, so yeah, there's the revenge plot kind of deal here where, look, first off, we're getting reparations. I mean, people are nuts. If you think California isn't going to pass a reparations bill in the near future, I think you're smoking crack. I mean, we're going to get reparations all over the place. Now, in this case, how do you get reparations? Well, you have to do exactly what Spencer said. You have to talk about some of the worst, most egregious examples, paint some cartoon history so they're completely uncomplicated, and then look at some crimes as all crimes, as many serious crimes are. Any serious crime is something that can't ultimately be repaid, and say, therefore, you owe a kind of blood debt that will have to continuously be repaid. There's no end to it, and there's no end to the logic either. It's a destructive kind of acid that corrodes human society and community, this kind of logic. I mean, look, if anyone wants to look back 100 years, 150 years at bad things that happened to them and their family or their ethnicity, right? I mean, there's a lot of Americans that can look back, and the whole world can keep on going and going and going. And there's, slave owners in all directions, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to get reparations. Now, how do you do that? How do you psyop that? Well, you can see Tulsa is a classic example. The HBO show Watchmen already centered the discussion around the Tulsa Massacre. It already has a future in which reparations are already being given, and then the evil poor whites are mad about it. The KKK sort of haunts America through this event. There's been multiple documentaries on the Tulsa Massacre. It's clearly something that's been grabbed as a direct way of arguing for reparations. And it's not an accident that people, whether it's not a conspiracy, people just take it up and they see what others are doing and they start copying and talking about this awful, moment in American history. And you can see where it's going. And it's not going to stop. I mean, you're going to get local regions and states passing reparations bills, and there is this sort of desire, as Spencer points out, it doesn't end. There's no logical end to this. It keeps going until it completely corrodes the social fabric and has everyone at each other's throats.
We are out of time for this episode of the Roundtable. It's been a wide-ranging and thoroughgoing discussion of pride, from which I learned a great deal. And thank you guys. I don't want us to end on a thoroughly dark note, because as Matt says, right, the logic of this stuff is explicit and visible. It is a dangerous and hugely harmful and divisive ideology, but at the same time, right, this is like the extremity of the crisis does kind of white pill me into thinking, at least, that people are starting to realize that this is unsustainable. And the first step is admitting you have a problem. Surely, it seems to me as if what we're looking at now is a kind of dead end away from which we must turn, because there is no other option. And so, as James has said, right, this is a kind of crisis that America has actually come up against in the past, and we do have the resources for recovering a robust sense of citizenship if we work at it. So thank you guys for this discussion. Thank you guys for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, please visit claremont.org/donate. We'd be very grateful. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our brand new Washington, D.C. based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. I will add that you should also sign up for our Substack, American Mindset, at americanmind.substack.com, where you will get more extra content to spice up your day. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a 5-star review. It really helps build the show. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. And thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.